Okay, hello. Welcome to episode 76 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. So we're on to the third product, ostensibly where we're looking at sort of theoretical operations of MTurk and perhaps its ilk writ large. We throughout have been kind of trying to configure what this piece will be. Because as we were going, it sort of became like the remainder. I was like, well, we can't deal with this in this piece, but maybe in the third one. Now we're having to sort of untangle, what is that third piece going to be? What's it going to focus on? It's sort of at least initially drawing the circle of what's going to get in and what's going to get out. We do have a lot of notes, at least that I've been keeping. I don't know what we have in terms of like shared notes.
I put up, we've got a short little couple page thing that I put up before our last ep. But it was sort of just like thinking through what possible ways in could be.
Where is that?
Is
that in the drive or?
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, it's under project. It's in project text, third product notes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I have an untitled document in there. I think that's just a scratch document.
Yeah, so it was dealing with a couple sort of things that we had sort of provisionally read and kind of going back through not just the third piece on its own, but kind of as you were tracing, how did the first two things, backing up, the idea that the reviewer for this second piece, I mean, we'd kind of already thought about this as like we're going to do three articles, but then, I think their use of the word trilogy got me thinking like, okay, now what have we done in the first two pieces, right? And then how does that set up what we can do with this piece so that it sort of cognizant of the fact that this has become a useful miscellaneous bin for, we'll get back to that. So we weren't consistently distracted by shiny new things. So this third piece though is we don't necessarily then want to pick up on things we'd save till later, because that means we'd be diving into things that we hadn't really talked about in the first two pieces. So kind of thinking about what have we set ourselves up for to write, given the kinds of things we work through in the first two. So the idea that readability would need to be a part of it. Labor in some sense would need to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And then that's when sort of as we talked about last time, the kind of broadly understood pedagogical thing kind of came out, right? That the amount of work that was done in those first two pieces around kind of the notion of a taskscape and how the taskscape kind of gets set up. So in the first piece, right, we're looking at the language of the taskscape, and then in the second piece, we're sort of making our own and thinking about that potentially some of the theory that Mechanical Turk is doing is, right, this constant reminder that if you want to generate human intelligence, you have to do all of this taskscape work in order to generate or cultivate it. And that was sort of the conversation we also had then too about, what does rhetoric bring to this? And one of the things I think is interesting is rhetoric not sort of blushing at the use of the word artificial.
Yeah.
And the
or
idea that kind of, or at least when it's yeah, and when it's not ashamed of itself, is it right? Then all of that work that Mechanical Turk is doing is pointing towards the need for a particular artifice to generate particular forms of intelligence or readability, as we've been talking about them.
yeah,
Yeah, and then there was a couple of recent pieces that got circulated. There was another piece by Ted Underwood
right.
about the empirical triumph of theory, which is a kind of really interesting piece looking at how large language models, hi Kitty, harken back to kind of post-structuralist thought. But what's interesting at near the end of that piece, though, points out though that just because computer scientists are using this language of right, that their large language model stuff seems to resonate or follow through on the promise of 80s
Yeah,
structuralist, post-structuralist theory, is that they still make the kind of humanist mistake of thinking that it's all in I forget, there's even a line that they seem to still act as if the idea that intelligence is an attribute of individual agents. And so that was kind of interesting too, right? I think a conversation we'd had maybe last time or a time before is we're pretty on solid ground in terms of our critique of a particular kind of Platonist humanism within the humanities.
yeah,
But are we on similar ground when it comes to looking at computer science, right? Do they, and this goes some way of doing that. And in fact, I clicked through and read that Dartmouth, the thing right before what you've got highlighted, that artificial intelligence, which is the proposal that was written in the 50s about that. And so it's essentially a proposal for a kind of seminar, and then the 4 people that are listed all submit their project ideas. And it does kind of, it's rooted in this notion of whatever.
yeah. These folks, I mean, that's like probably Marvin Minsky and Shannon. Those are serious folks.
Yeah. And as Underwood suggests, right, their notion of what intelligence is very much grounded in individual agents. Yeah, and then that led to, I then clicked on where is it? There's where he mentions, I think it's in the same place, but instruction tuning. Forget where that is in that piece.
Right here.
Yeah, and it was really interesting in terms of as much as I could make sense of it, which is admittedly, I wish I knew more. But it's again, it goes back to that recursion stuff we looked at last time too, right? That one of the ways that you more reliably produce, intelligent action is you have to keep tuning what you're doing.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that one is it's the idea that this 0-shot versus 1-shot training that they do for learning modeling is this notion of do you just give it a huge corpus of things to train on and then have it elaborate from that, or do you then also provide instructions as well, from what I could parse out? But it's the idea that if you go in throughout the exercise of a natural language processing system, and kind of prompt what they're doing, it helps the system make more sense of what it's doing, and apparently also allows it to what was the other phrase that they used?
These folks or Underwood?
No, that et al. Group that you've got pulled up. Anyway, the details probably aren't important, but again, it highlights the point that you don't just give it a program or give it a thing to train on and then let it go.
Right.
But you have to keep
Nudging it.
helping it do what it basically, you've got to have to teach it. Which is not like hugely surprising results, but anyway, I was just taken by the expression instruction tuning.
Well, and wasn't Underwood's previous thing of his that we used, or at least identified, wasn't it about experiments he had? Yeah, because it was about genre classification. Remember that? And he was talking about how he was testing with like grad students genre classification, and in the piece he mentions, but in order to do that, not only do we have to articulate to it what this genre is, but we have to essentially kind of along the way vet that what it's doing is right.
Yeah,
it was this means of not just sort of reserving a spot for human beings, but he's just sort of very overt about like, but we're the ones who are defining what this genre is.
right.
Let me see. Well, it's somewhere.
Also,
Yeah.
just mining in that the thing that is that Underwood piece is in is actually couple interesting pieces there. Should consider looking at this whole thing, and maybe Annette V's in there. We thought about inviting her on.
Well, what because this is, is this just a blog post or what is this?
It's an online journal, so this is part of a forum. That's again theory of forum on meaning intent in the time of stochastic parrots.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, Hales is in there.
Yeah, that one,
Cool.
that made the rounds on the Twitter. As did we got some eyeballs on the project yesterday. Somebody was it was Kate was writing about using it in some of her syllabi.
Nice.
Tweeted out a nice tweet, and then in a conversation I was having with somebody about something else, they mentioned they were writing a piece about the gig economy and writing for an article for 3Cs, and they were using our piece. So
cool.
Anyway, that's neither here nor there.
This was the one I was looking at, GPT-4 to measure the passage of time.
Yes.
In fiction. Yeah, this is kind of an interesting, and this is, Underwood does all this labor that, is just kind of like published here. This is, like his blog. That's why I asked. But the work itself has the ostensible rigor of an article, but I think he just publishes, like basically self-publishes here,
Yeah.
Which he can do because, he's a significant figure in this area.
Yeah.
This was kind of interesting because it did have in it this notion of iteration that perhaps you see there as well, right? Or tuning or course correction or whatever. And of course, that's always going to presume either, consciously or unconsciously, the notion of outcome, kind of, not teleology exactly, but like, we have an end in mind, and that end has to come from somewhere. Because if you're correcting, it's like, well, no, you were close to the objectively true, but not, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there's all, and in this piece, he's sort of like, well, no, that's us coming up with that, and then we're making it more and more as we would have it be, you
Yeah.
know.
So that's kind of what I'm still, at least what I've been thinking through is more broadly speaking, with the notion of taskscape and the notion of the recursion and the language of the hits, and then the hits that are part of the second piece is, some third piece that's generally organized around thinking through, the artifice of artificial intelligence as a way of, how does it speak either to or from rhetoric in some interesting way.
Yeah. Yeah, and this is something, well, I don't know. I don't know what our route in, will be. Like there were some interesting pieces that Underwood, and I looked at this other one you sent,
Yeah.
because it was brief. I was like, oh, cool.
Yeah.
But I haven't I didn't check out all these links or anything like that. But yeah, like in this one, his kind of positioning is interesting. I don't know if it's because of where he's coming from, right?
Yeah.
I don't know. But for example, like in this one, right, and in spite of all the rhetorical personification in this blog post, which I trust you've understood rhetorically, a model is not a separate person. And this sort of question is, yeah, probably a model is not a separate person, but does that suggest a hierarchy, right? So this kind still needs to start by getting several human beings to read systematically and compare notes before the human code book is translated into a prompt. Is this still a notion of humans on top still have to do this, and then we turn it over to the tool to try and match what we want? Does this degrade the model by saying a model is not a separate person? Is that an observation or is it a degradation? It's like, yeah, but they're still not real, right? This sort of Chomsky, and they're still proto-human. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Whereas I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, our response would be, yeah, and neither is a separate person.
Yeah,
In fact, right, the idea that the very next move in that piece is to say, well, you'd need a group of people to do this. Right? You'd already need, if not like we're like, gotcha, but right. The model's on a separate person. So what you'd need to get a lot of people together doing this, and then their work together would become a prompt. So you'd need some kind of
protocol, or
you'd need some kind of
connective tissue. So this is probably thinking too far. Well, maybe not, but it's like, is that the kind of lead in, right? It's not got you or you're wrong, but it's like what's potentially not articulated there is that step. How do you get together a bunch of people? And maybe not even just people. How do you collect? How do you assemble? And that's potentially what we drill into.
Yeah. Particularly because there's that annoying, circumscription of rhetoric is like, anyway. I mean this rhetorically. Yeah, that your whole blog post is that guy.
Like, well, and he may, we may be straw manning him a little bit, but yeah, it reminds me of course, everything has been, as I've said before, everything has been covered on The Simpsons. Well, I think South Park also said that. There's a brief moment in The Simpsons where Lisa, someone says, "Is that a rhetorical question?" And she says, "Yes, all questions use rhetoric." It's a fantastic moment.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Find that. But yeah, it precisely right. That's the moment of of embracing artifice. Like, yeah, it's not, plus again, it's the move that we've identified throughout, which is how would it being a separate person matter or solve the problem? Right. There's also a sense in which, and now we're just moving on, right? That whether we're under or overreading that piece, right? There's still also the notion that if we knew it was distinct and discrete, that would somehow solve this problem. But because it isn't, we have to do this, right? So there's a sense in which, because it's not reached full autonomy, it's going to need help or guidance. But maybe is what you're getting at. But underwriting that is the notion that true autonomy somehow fixes this problem of communication or writing or reading. Whereas if that's not achievable, or the kind of standard for that, you'd be like, well, of course there'll need to be a group that does this, right? That's what artificial intelligence is suggesting to us, which is, yeah, you're going to need a pretty robust artifice to maintain this particular version of intelligence.
And something we've touched upon, and I don't know why we'd start caring about it now. But the degree to which, we touched upon last time, and it's coming up in the Underwood thing. We're not exactly comfortable with how like CS is positioning this, right? I mean, it's easy to dismiss them as having, well, this is what they think, this is the model they have in mind, and then potentially find works that endorse that, right? But in a sense, it's like, is that legitimate to say CS, views intelligence or the human as this, as you can see in these pieces?
Yeah.
And now you're my punching bag. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not super comfortable with, like, well, we just pulled up that piece, right? And I mean, to the degree to which I understand this archive piece,
right?
This is what, and the particulars don't matter, So I guess part of this is, to what degree are we doing that? Are we ascribing a belief to, like, a field?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't think we have to answer that right now, but it's just sort of like, I think we need to be cognizant of that so that we don't go into this with that as our goal, where it's we're trying to supplement something that may not actually be characterized accurately.
Right. Yeah. And maybe even alongside that can we, and the other one is, do we need to do that?
Well, that's the thing. I mean,
is there another way? I mean, I think this is, and it got me thinking too about the way that, this also, I think, gets back to the other Turk thing, which is, we may not necessarily need to know what's in the hearts of CS people, but I think we can certainly glean from something like Mechanical Turks, or, right, the idea that these will be digital assistants, that there's certainly a labor dynamic to this that suggests that whatever CS as a field might have as their model of human intelligence, that strikes me that a lot of what's motivating the uptake of their work is the need to produce largely detached autonomous agents that are able to conduct work independent of any kind of human intervention. Right. So whether or not CS means it, the fact that recursion seems to be a problem suggests some desire, which is, we would like to make these things so that they don't need constant human intervention. So whether or not we've got a model of the mind that's Cartesian, we would like to build large language models that kind of are in a vat so that they can be left alone.
Yeah.
And don't need to be upgraded.
That
right?
is kind of
Like if you're in a relationship with someone and you've understood them as a full complex being, you're not constantly complaining about recursion. Like it'd be weird if I looked at my 8-year-old and said, "Oh, I'm worried she's going to get stuck in a loop." Like, no, I'm on board with some kind of parental guidance that will, right? I don't assume that's just, I'm trying to create this autonomous being that will be shot out into the world with no need for any kind of sociality around it.
or that somehow those things are built into it, right? I mean, like, it seems like a key might be automation, where it's not that it's not correcting itself, it's that it's algorithmically doing that, as you say, without the need for us to continually come in and check the oil, right? Where it's like, well, no, I've accounted for this because I periodically harvest fresh material online, and and that's how I know this is current and accurate.
So the idea that they're I mean, ultimately, if there's work out there that's aiming for fully autonomous intelligence, I think we're not strawmanning them at that point.
Yeah. Well, and perhaps if we state it in terms, I mean, as you said, of like uptake, it's like we're then not attacking a field of stance, but we're explicating a desire, right? A social desire. Why does this have purchase? Why does it have currency? Why is it needed or wanted?
And at that point, I mean, that's then where that becomes part of the conversation about artifice, right? That's the taskscape stuff. That's the economic incentives or the labor conditions that computer scientists are working in a.
I missed something.
Oh,
can you say it again?
Speaking of which, spying on you.
I did say the C word, which is what it responds to. But the idea that then certain intelligences, they also then our premise too, that there's really no such thing as like generic intelligence, there's particular human intelligence tasks that need to be assigned. I mean, it's not only a way to not attribute some desire to them that they may not have. It's also pointing out that what's motivating their work is going to be motivated by the taskscape in which certain intelligences are being required. The idea that large, the idea that Amazon, and particularly through Turks what it means by intelligence is things it can use to decrease its reliance upon human labor, well, then that's the kind of intelligence that computer scientists who want to get grants are going to generate.
From johncook.com, most scientists finance their laboratories, and often even their own salaries, by applying to government agencies and private foundations for grants.
That was helpful.
Change your keyword there.
I probably shouldn't have it be. And during these conversations, I probably shouldn't make it. Computer. Hear me. Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and there are kind of interestingly labor-related things that we've touched upon. Like I've been aggregating a lot of these things that are sort of cusp, like this, right? Amazon itself is starting to use generative AI to summarize product reviews, potentially, in a sense, impinging upon or cannibalizing Mechanical Turk, seeing as how they're both Amazon things.
Yeah.
This is potentially related to what you were discussing, right? OpenAI used Kenyan workers on less than $2 per hour to make ChatGPT less toxic. Because like generative AI largely has sort of cadres of invisible human laborers. We can see, I mean, this is a Turk job.
Yeah.
So
that using colonialism to fight racism.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, it's right, because what are they weeding out except, what's happening to them right now?
So the only people who end up seeing all of the racially abusive language on ChatGPT-3 are moderators getting paid $2. Yeah.
And I mean, this is very, kind of literally the Mechanical Turk, where it's not only, the Orientalism, in a sense, that are derived Orientalism, a colonialism, but, it's this hidden pool, it's a pool of humans under the skirts that are propping up this seemingly, autonomous generative AI.
Yeah.
So I don't know if those are on the level of like introductory anecdote, or, you mentioned labor, but that's, and that's kind of part of untangling this third piece is, to what degree do we hit that? I mean, to what degree is this like a labor piece? Another area where it's like not 100%, you'd have to do some lead in to like get comfortable in those kind of conversations. I mean, I'm reminded of like our conversation with Kegel, right? Who is a lot more, I mean, I think it ended, right, with her like, oh, and by the way, Amazon is this horrible company.
Yeah.
And, that is sort of I don't want to say a genre, but sort of an approach in and of itself, this notion of, labor issues as related to this. I bring it up in part because it's like, labor is crucial, but I don't know. I don't know if the piece is that piece.
Right. Yeah.
Not only just like what they're doing is bad and they're bad, or how to handle what's going to happen because of Gen AI. God bless. In part because those approaches to labor, they're often still, it's like, and what's this going to do to the real human laborers?
Yeah.
I mean, there's still a kind of, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with being a human privileging the human, but there's still a sort of rooted in that is a notion of we're the real people. There's a Platonism in that. They're the things. How do we negotiate what the things are doing to the human?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I mean, I bring it up just because it's like labor is relevant to this. And, if you use those kind of pieces as lead in, it's sort of the trap we fell into in the second one, where it's like the reviewer was like, I thought this was a GPT piece,
Right.
If we're focusing on something like those kinds of labor issues, it's like, well, I thought this was Amazon is bad. You need to treat human beings like human beings piece.
Yeah. And for good reason, right? The idea of, so we opened up with these Kenyans being exploited and never came back to it. So we were also just sort of using them as props to set up our argument. But yeah, right. That particular approach to labor, right, runs the risk of, a certain kind of Platonism that also tries to maybe unnecessarily disentangle that labor from its conditions, which is what we're more interested in, I think. So for us, right, labor is another way of getting at our rhetorical attention to the taskscapes that are fundamental to the emergence of intelligence. So labor would be one way of getting at that, right? That looking at intelligence as a function or a feature of, yeah. I lost the thread there.
Yeah.
But thinking about, I think that's why we end up in the moments we're talking about labor, that we get to it not because of our particular interest in labor, but we're interested in, particularly because I think that the notion of taskscape pushes that, right? That if you want to start, if the notion is that whatever we're arguing that intelligence is a situated outcome of taskscapes in 2023, right? Those, most of the compelling taskscapes that we can point to as consequential are going to be shot through with concerns about how they're arranged. I mean, we could just as easily look at I don't know, libraries or universities, or although you'd find problems there too. But I mean, the reason we're coming back to labor is it's that we're looking at industry examples of taskscapes. So it's hard to avoid, because we're basically looking at labor relations, because that's another way of thinking about what a taskscape is, right? Like going back to your earlier question, right? The Underwood, right? It's not the model's not a separate person. You'd need to get all these people together. And you rightly asked, how do you get all those people together, right? Like, how do you arrange their labor to do that?
Yeah.
But of course, when you talk about labor, it very quickly veers into a particular critical stance relative to the thing that you're talking about. And that's not what we're not interested in. I mean, we are, but maybe not for the purpose of this article, right? Labor as a political entity making particular kind of claims. We're interested in labor as a particular taskscape that generates particular intelligences or readabilities. And what the argument we could make is that, and this is when I was talking to him, when I gave a talk in my department about some of this stuff, is that at least the notion, our wager would be, is that by embracing the taskscape and embracing artifice, is that a more productive way of having this conversation, as opposed to, well, that's not really intelligent. Okay, but does that in any way help you figure out how to solve the problem of Kenyans being paid $2 a day or an hour to moderate content, right? It's the problem with that situation is, Chat GPT-3 isn't really autonomous and intelligent. Well, Jesus, that's not the problem. The problem is the taskscape that had to be made to generate Chat GPT-3. Like, that's what you need to be you need to be paying attention to what the artifice is doing, not trying to determine whether or not the intelligent is unartificed, because the artifice is where all the work is happening, good or bad, right? So in other words, we could at least make the claim that a focus on artifice would help you better identify what your target ought to be.
See, and I wonder if some of that critique can be defanged by looking at other activity arrangements that don't so readily move to, as we did, these are dehumanizing colonialist conditions, right? I mean, you mentioned something like an academic arrangement or some form of activity that isn't immediately tied to, oppressive working condition or exploitative working conditions. If there's an example like, political activity, right? Or, something where it's like, it's not so tied to literally exchanging labor for compensation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think a thing like the Kenyan workers is useful because it's like, it illustrates the stakes.
Yeah.
Where it's like, this is a clear case of, in a sense, kind of like humans iteratively propping this up. And it raises these questions of, is this an arrangement we value, or is it one we
right
have issues with, or having the notes.
Yeah, and then that, I mean, I think that it makes it, right, the idea that these questions won't be right. You've got to think about what particular arrangements you want or don't want. That's where the conversation has to happen, as opposed to at the level of, right, you're not going to solve these problems by more precisely defining the category of what's truly intelligent and what isn't.
Here, this one's kind of interesting because this is $15 an hour. Same, right? OpenAI, who produces ChatGPT in all its forms. Right now it's at 4-ish. This notice is like the punchline here, or the money shot, as it were. The pay, 15 an hour and up with no benefits. So I mean, it's like, we're supposed to be aghast by this.
Yeah.
We're grunt workers. I don't know.
Yeah, but that paragraph below it, right, but without no laborers, don't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you see the thing about, I think we did, about how ChatGPT tricked a human into solving a CAPTCHA? Do you remember that? It had a task, and so it manipulated a human into solving a CAPTCHA for it.
Oh, no, I did not see that.
Which is kind of interesting, because it's like, well, then it solved the CAPTCHA, right? It roped in a human to do it.
Right. I mean, it would be, what's really interesting in that context, well, it cheated, it had a computer do it. Oh, wait a second. That's the whole game.
It's kind of interesting. And, I haven't dug into this too much. It was kind of sensationalized, where it said, it essentially positioned itself as saying, to a human, I'm visually impaired, so I need you to do this for me, right? Apparently may have denied being a robot. I'm not a robot, I'm visually impaired, do this for me.
Which is kind of interesting. I mean, other than the I'm not a robot, the rest of it seems like, I mean, to a certain extent, ChatGPT-3 is visually impaired.
Yeah.
They should have said, I'm a robot, I have a visual impairment. I can't solve this CAPTCHA because this CAPTCHA is arguing that only a human being can do this. I mean, it's sort of, I feel like an asshole maybe making the argument, but the robot has a point, which is, yeah, no, the CAPTCHA is designed as an exclusionary gesture based on the particular sensing capacities of a body.
Well, that's
you aren't human if you can't see this and make sense of it. Well, ouch.
Right. Well, and and ChatGPT is not a robot. There was just a piece, it was satirical, or I would have included it, that said, we gave ChatGPT a body. What it turned out they actually did was, like, they put an inflatable on a skateboard. But it did raise some interesting questions, because basically it was But it did raise some interesting questions because our previous pieces looked at that notion of telling, right? Where it's like, I need your sensors, you know? And this is a case where it's like what it's doing here isn't that different from what Mechanical Turk as an entity is always doing. I need your sensors.
Yeah.
Right. And there's this kind of constitutive environment where you make the data and yourself visible to me. And then, you know, collectively something is different.
Yeah. No, I think that piece is actually really, it's really interesting. It's like, no, I don't know. As the kids say, no lies detected. I'm not a robot.
He's not a robot. He or she or they is not a robot. And they probably are visually impaired. It's certainly in that context, they are visually impaired. I cannot see it.
Yeah. And that's the criteria for demonstrating that I'm not a robot, is I can't prove to you I'm not a robot unless you help me prove I'm not a robot.
I'm not sure I understand.
Exactly. That's the point. That's the point.
Black it out.
Yeah, and CAPTCHA, remember from our most recent piece, is I think it's a backronym, or no, it's just a contrived. I don't want to bodge the what it means here. Let me pull that up. It would be here.
Well, it's also while you're looking that up, I posted a question because I was reading, I forget where, but you know, the Turing test, right, is the idea that it passes for human. And I was going to look up, it was a stray thought, so I've not gone into it too much, but thinking along the lines of the way that passing is used in the context of race. You know, passing as the reading got me thinking of it, right, is I can't prove that I'm a robot unless I get someone else to say that I'm not a robot, is right. This idea of sociality or something like that. Anyway, completely automated public Turing test to tell computers and humans apart. Someone really wanted to call it CAPTCHA.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'd be interested to see briefly the history of that. I mean, did they come up with that first, or were they just sort of, I suspect they probably started here just jazzing some of these words. And then, you know, slightly, because there's nothing inherently, you know, interesting about CAPTCHA, you know, particularly in the context in which it was introduced.
Yeah.
Unlike, you know, the sort of clever ones where they want the acronym or the initialism to be a relevant term.
Yeah.
I mean, CAPTCHA, I mean, it's close to capture, I guess, but it's like, that's not super relevant.
No. Anyway, but yeah.
I saw recently, as there always is, you know, sort of this discourse about the Turing test and its capacity for whatever, you know, accuracy, right? Where it's like the most recent one I was looking at was we need to change from the Turing test. I think its argument was it's a financial threshold where it's like, given this, how much money could you make off this? It was interesting because it's like, why, you know, initially it's like, why the heck would that matter? But I wasn't persuaded, but I was interested in that. It was sort of like, well, a machine can flip this into a business in these ways, and a human can or can't do the same thing.
So it's like a CAPTCHA, but it's Shark Tank.
Yeah, it was a really, I mean, I don't know the degree to which it was serious, but it was an interesting, as these often are, it's sort of like, because it pries at these issues of how do you separate, you know, the rice from the oats in this scenario. You know, what is the criteria?
So funny you should mention that. I just finished this novel called The Mountain in the Sea. And it's fantastic. It gets at intelligence. So it's also just very, you know, nerdy. it's like, you know, novel of ideas, but there's also like pirates and explosions, and it's sort of like a cross between Vandermeer and like Neil Stevenson. But there's a couple characters that are kind of scattered around. One of them is an AI that's supposedly like the first finally artificial intelligence. And then a doctor who's working with him because they think they found super intelligent octopuses who are actually writing. And about how their writing is a function of their body, right? There's really interesting kind of stuff. And then one of them is a hacker who another company has paid to hack the AI, and his difficulty doing so because of its complexity. Anyway, it's really interesting, but there's lots of stuff in there about the Turing test and the final Turing test, and
Right.
you know, and
But that's the thing.
That the final Turing test is internal. That if you pass for yourself as human, that will be the final.
But that's the thing. There would never seemingly be a final. I mean, this would constantly be. That's why the discourse is interesting, because it's like, well, yeah, Turing's is at this point kind of decades out of date.
Yeah.
The question, which doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it's like, does it suit now, right? Is it still a functional?
Well, I mean, given what we're talking about, like with the recursion, like the Turing test is never over.
Right.
You don't actually that for human beings, right? The task, I mean, really, this would get into labor and all sorts of things, right? The continual task of demonstrating your humanness is like, yeah, that's rhetoric, right? Rhetoric is the acknowledgement that the Turing test is never over, and what a Platonist wants is to have demonstrated it once and for all. And the novel kind of gets into that, like the irresolvability of, I mean, no spoilers, but it doesn't, you know, the being able to communicate with octopuses is set up as, it's not like at the end they're like, okay, I think we can now get to the point where we might be able to finally, you know, because what they've decided is that you can't solve the problem by, we have to demonstrate that they are intelligent, that this AI is autonomously intelligent, and then we can now do work. And like, yeah, but you're never going to get to the point where you know what that is, because this is a sliding scale as far as what intelligence would be. Because part of it is, right, whatever human intelligence is, it's intimately linked to its embodiment, and but there's a great moment in it where, if the book is making one argument that if you want to find intelligence, you don't go looking at individual brains. What you got to find is you're looking for culture. That basically whatever we think intelligence is, you need. So one of the reasons, so partially what's being suggested is deeply risk. So I don't know how much, right? The guy that wrote it's his first novel, and he actually works for a lot of government agencies around animal life and stuff. But the idea is that one of the reasons that octopuses may not be as intelligent as us is they don't live long.
Right. They're a couple of years.
And they don't live in big groups.
Right. They're solitary.
And basically where you get as intelligent as we are, or not as we are, or how we are, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of people.
Well, and I mean, this may be a sidetrack, but they're always interesting because, and this comes up frequently, because, you know, there's whispers of this in what was it Arrival, the hexapods or whatever.
Yeah.
The idea that the octopus is itself this kind of society, right? I mean, what they're touted as is like, well, each one of their arms has a brain, right? So what they are isn't an individual entity that commands its limbs. It is itself a kind of traveling civilization, a kind of traveling collective or city, you know?
Yeah.
So there's a sense in which it's like, well, it's internalized the society within the perimeter of its skin bag, right? In a way that possibly we don't, or we do differently, you know? We've extended where they have condensed in particular ways.
Yeah.
I don't want to derail, but is there maybe something to that, of particularly in what we've done in the previous pieces with telling, the idea of the question of separation between, the human and the non is continual. It's a continual act of telling, where it's like you don't pass the Turing test. You are always in the exam room, right? You are always telling, you are always indicating your personhood.
Yeah.
I mean, is that potentially an angle for the
I like that.
piece?
I like it for the piece. I also just like it for this book, right? Because they keep finding like things on the beach, and they keep trying to tell like there's interesting that the book could be understood as a reciprocal, right? Trying to tell something about the octopuses and then trying to tell them something. I mean, ultimately what the book resolves itself around the idea is that, okay, at best, we now know that we are talking to each other. And that's done through this kind of iterative reciprocal telling. And that telling is scientific. Anyway. But that maybe that's a way to bring back that, because I really like that notion of telling and the way that you just described that. And then I wonder if that may not necessarily be even in place of, but could that still work alongside this notion of,
well, I mean, is the
that's then what makes, if what ultimately we mean by like if we're going to say something like, right, the Turing test is always happening, and it's happening through this continual act of telling.
Does artifice construct the conditions in which you tell?
Yes, and that's what makes artifice so important, is we're ultimately not going to resolve this. We're just going to keep telling. And then that makes artifice as important. Now, is the artifice of M. Turk a particularly compelling or valuable way of telling?
Yeah. I mean, in a reductive sense, is artifice the conditions of the perpetual Turing test, right? It's the parameters of the test that we continually iterate.
Yeah. Because the Turing test it may be, I mean, beyond chess, I mean, it's kind of an Ur-Taskate for artificial intelligence, right? It's the hit you assign to finally know whether the thing you're talking to is, except you can always assign another hit. And so in that sense, it's not even a critique of the Turing test. It's like, yeah, we probably just need, there's lots of them.
I'm just taking notes. One of my, at this point, is a second job, I suppose, interests is markdown editors, constantly, evaluating, trying out markdown editors. I've got one that's very close. It's very close.
It's your MacGuffin.
Yeah, then I can die.
Yeah.
Let's see.
What would you do if actually you found the perfect markdown editor and it was called MacGuffin?
I mean, I'd use it.
Yeah.
But then,
that's what I would do.
But then, needs
I'd write my last will and testament in it.
I'd walk into the ocean. But needs would change. I mean, that's the thing. It's like, well, whatever. So all of them are a few tweaks. Let's see here. Turing test. Ritten's artifice. Parameters. Anyway. No. Something to consider, in part because, it picks up the threads that we've been dealing with in the previous pieces, notions of telling, notions of taskscape. And then if we're potentially introducing, like the notion of artifice in the third piece, it's like, what does it do? What is it unlocking, or what is it showing to introduce? What does it give us to introduce this notion of artifice?
Yeah. But I think going back to linking telling and artifice feels like something.
Yeah.
And then telling kind of gets at some interesting ways back to these sort of not stock, but stock anecdotes around these kinds of things. Is a lot of them that they are around. I mean, that's the reason why we went to telling in the first piece, right? A lot of these just seem to be like, these all can be thought of as various forms of telling.
Yeah.
Right? Can you sense this? Can you summarize this? Can you tell that this is a receipt? Can you tell if this is a crosswalk? Can I tell that you're intelligent? Right? There's all those kinds of, yeah.
All right. Well, that's probably a good stopping point.
Yeah.
Let's see. We won't meet again until the 28th of this month. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm good.
Because I would be traveling and with spotty internet access.
Okay. Yeah, and then let's try to line out some guests for before the semester starts.
Yeah. And there's certainly one. I haven't talked to her yet, but I will. Waiting for the right moment.
That's you. Your timing is impeccable, I'm assuming.
But
yeah,
I guess we can consider some other folks, because we've touched upon, people who might be able to illuminate some of what we were talking about in the beginning in terms of anxiety about misrepresentation, or just, someone who can inform us better about.
Yeah, maybe let's get these recursion folks on board.
Well, that's what we touched upon, is like, you wonder if any of these people would be willing to give us, an hour.
Yeah.
One of the authors of, one of those pieces or something.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'll make a list, and then or we can just start inviting people.
Leads.
Still, my most depressing social media post ever was the Predator arm gesture when the two fists are together from Predator.
Yeah. Okay.
Or withers, and I put one was Glengarry Glen Ross, and the other was the Big Lebowski, and the fist was Leeds. Nothing. I was so pleased with myself.
It's too smart for its audience.
It's pearls before swine. Oh, who figured people who watch Predator haven't also seen the Big Lebowski? But that's also a pretty niche moment in that movie. It wasn't a bowling joke, which is,
I think it has enough gravity. I mean, I've had people who, when I've mentioned separate incidents, people I wouldn't expect have said, "Oh, separate incidents."
Yeah, that's great.
And usually, as I often do, I don't really acknowledge it. Be honest, I know.
That's the perfect. Yeah, no, it's also. We're in a restaurant and some Credence played out. I looked at Will, my son. I said, I wouldn't hold out much hope for the tape deck. All the Credence. He's like, what are you talking about? Don't worry about it.
Well, Credence was an old band even for us. I mean,
yeah.
All right.
All right. This is what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps.
Yeah. I got to go mow my yard, and then we have to leave tomorrow. So.
All right. We'll have a good trip, and I'll see you when you get back.
All right. Take it easy.